Known as the female Al Capone of Washington, D.C., Odessa Madre ran the streets of that same city. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Madre built a self-made empire that illegally served liquor during the early parts of the Prohibition era. Her income was supplemented by providing people contacts for gambling, drugs, and running a brothel, where the neighborhood could enjoy drinking, getting high, and placing bets. Everyone knew Madre and would mostly go through her. It's been reported through the Washington Post that she had many police officers on payroll. She practically ran the police department. Becoming one of the wealthiest people in DC, constantly flashing her jewelry, expensive furs, luxury cars, and more, Madre's powerful ruling lasted nearly 6 decades and would come to an unfortunate end as she would die penniless with friends and family unable to pay for her funeral services, even though throughout her life she took care of those around her. So who is Odessa Madre? She's a story you should know. Born in 1907 to a barber and a seamstress, Odessa Madre was raised in what is often described as the Cow Town, the queen of the Washington underworld, otherwise known as Odessa Madre, attended and excelled academically at Washington's elite public high school, Dunbar, where she would graduate with honors in 1925. Described as being as rigorous as some colleagues, Madre was one of only 3 dark-skinned African Americans in attendance. Madre once described her time at Dunbar as painful, but formative. She was often teased and harassed not only by the whites, but the other blacks that attended simply because of her darker pigmented skin. Producer and creator of the documentary Odessa's Reign states that this speculated torment she endured from her fair-skinned classmates would push her to turn her skills to bootlegging and number running. You wonder what made me choose the life I did? I wonder too. Sometimes I just figured that I didn't want to be like them Yale's gals. They called me the big black mother with the television eyes. There was only 3 blacks back then. I mean, black like me. I had good diction, I knew the gestures, but they always made fun of me. Odessa began her reign at 17, first by selling liquor by the shot in a time where the selling of alcohol was prohibited. Madre changed what a mobster was supposed to look like and sound like with her sophisticated diction. Her arrest record goes all the way back to 1932. According to the Washington Post, it's been reported that she has been arrested over 30 times on 57 charges. These charges even include a neurotics violation. It was Madre's strength with running numbers combined with her people skills that quickly led her to success in gambling and networking the underground. Madre found a home in this life where she was accepted for who she was. No one cared how she looked or that she was an open lesbian. They all respected her in the hustle that she brought. Her upbringing in Cowtown put her in close relations to the Irish cops who lived there. And her fair and honest demeanor and fickle generosity meant those same cops remained loyal to her for years to come, turning a blind eye on her gambling rings when their children followed in their father's footsteps, becoming captains, lieutenants, and superintendents. When it came to Madre's own sexuality, she would address it in the same Washington Post interview. I had made up my mind not to go to Howard. I wasn't gonna fool with those gals up there. And I just couldn't keep a man? I guess I was just born to give orders, not take them. What kind of man wants to be with a woman like that? Growing up in Cowtown, you couldn't help but see what was going on. I was always a bit of tomboyish and curious. So I hung around the Jill joints and the gaming houses, and I wanted to get in on some fun too. Shoot, why should just the boys have all the fun? In the historically segregated underground, it's said that Madre bridged the racial gap with a deft hand for negotiation. In 1980, a former Vice Squad detective said this when asked about Odessa Madre. She knew practically every big-time gangster nationwide. She was what they call a counselor in the mob. She meditated disputes between blacks and whites, a referee. She kept a lot of people from getting hurt. She said herself, "All the big shots were looking to do business with me. My protection would automatically be theirs, too." I said to myself, let the good times roll. Needless to say, the connections in the police force tended to benefit her and her business just as much as they did from her. If things got too hot and a raid was expected, her contacts would give her a well in advance warning, letting her know that whatever didn't need to be there at the time of the raid wasn't there. At her prime, it said Madre would enter rooms fully clothed in mink, an entourage of women for sale right behind her. Aside from her famously successful gambling ring, Madre's brothel was one of her most lucrative endeavors. She's famous for providing fair-skinned African-American women to wealthy politicians and other big names in DC at the time. She says her choice of women for her prostitutes is reminiscent of the torment she received from her lighter-skinned classmates at Dunbar. By the 1940s, Madre was running an empire of bars and brothels, such as Club Madre on Black Broadway, that sported regular appearances from the likes of Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, and Count Basie. In the 1950s, Madre said this to a Washington reporter: "You say, was it worth it? Child, you wonder, does crime pay?" Madre asked. "I'll tell you, yes, it pays a hell of a lot of money. And money's something. I don't care who you are. When you got money, you can get a lot of doors open because there's always some larcenous heart who's gonna listen to you. Say what you want, but Madre was a woman of the people. She had a reputation around town of aiding the small men and women. If you were ever stuck in a bind, Madre would always be there to help. The protection she had automatically became yours. It's even reported that at her peak, Madre's net income was estimated to be more than $100,000, which is equivalent to $2.1 million today. Throughout her life, she was described as famously generous, clothing disadvantaged children and handing out wads of cash to the homeless. Longtime friend of Madre said he spent nearly 13 years incarcerated for robbery, and upon his release, it was Odessa Madre who provided him with a plethora of new suits and a room to stay in. Odessa was basically forced into a life of crime. There weren't hardly any jobs for Black people like her when she was coming along. And once you got an arrest record, you could hang it up. Odessa was a motherly type. She did a lot of people favors, loaned a lot of needy people money, as well as provided contracts for gambling and drugs. She knew practically every big-time gangster nationwide. She was what they called a counselor in the mob. She mediated disputes between Blacks and whites, a referee. She kept a lot of people from getting hurt. Towards the end of her reign, people began to take advantage of Madre's generosity. People had also assumed that because she had acquaintances on the force for petty crime protection, it made her a snitch or an informant to them. Around 1950, officers began investigating Madre. These police would find payoffs by local mobsters paid to the police department, and those payments were funneled through none other than Odessa Madre. As a result, 2 sergeants testified that they were demoted and assigned to school crossing duty because they refused a payoff from Madre. Somebody had to give them money. If anybody was lucky enough to be able to get protection, it was because they was lucky enough to have my recommendation to the police. That's how it worked. I would tell the police if you were okay and if it was going to be worth their while. Then you give me the money and I would make the drop. They wouldn't take it from anybody. In 1961, she was arrested with an ounce of cocaine and sentenced to 7 years in prison. After her release in 1968, the police were still on her. Again in 1973, the Drug Abuse Law Enforcement Task went to her home in Washington to serve a grand jury subpoena. While there, they discovered a handgun, which gave reason for her to be arrested once again. Madre would be arrested several more times before the 1970s were over. The cost of the lawyers were getting to her, and this was the beginning of the end for the queen. By the late 70s, she was struggling financially, and by the 80s, she had lost her homes and her car. Odessa Madre died in 1990 alone on 10th and R Streets Northwest, what is described as one of the worst ghettos in Washington. Her body remained unclaimed for 8 days, and her friends managed only to scrape together $51 for burial. You know, in another time and under other circumstances, the question of whether things could have gone differently for a woman who undoubtedly possessed the charisma and makings of a great leader still remains. Stories of Black women becoming self-made entrepreneurs is slightly more common in the present day, but were nearly non-existent during the mid-1900s when Madre was active. Odessa Madre was a queen of the underworld, constantly showing how unafraid and unapologetic she was in her appearances and practices. Odessa Madre's story represents one of Black history's most untold stories, and one could only wish Madre's associates took care of her in her old age, as she took care of the neighborhood all her life. Stay up to date with the latest news and comedy by subscribing here to our YouTube channel, follow Comedy Hype across all social media, and look out for new original content on our streaming service at comedyhype.com. For Hype Plus News, I'm Symphony Thompson.